So were you successful using our recipes array here and replicating this part in the code as often as needed and fill it with the data for the recipe? Now clearly we need ngFor for this. So let's add ngFor. This is the directive which allows us to repeat code in our template. And here I want to loop through all the recipes. So I will actually create a local variable named recipe. This name is totally up to you. That will simply store the recipe of each iteration in our loop. And I will loop through all the recipes. So through this recipes property we created here in the TypeScript file. Now with that, I'll also bring this into new lines here to make it a bit easier to read. With that, everywhere inside this ngFor loop, so everywhere here, we can use this recipe now. So let's use it to output the name. We can use string interpolation for that. String interpolation, as you learned, allows us to output some text anywhere in our template. Now we got this single recipe, but that's going to be an object looking like our model. Because remember, the recipes array simply holds an array of our recipes, so a single item simply looks like this. It has a name, a description, and the image path. Well, with this information, we can of course access the name here, like this. And for the description, we can replace this with recipe description. So we're going to use the property names we set up here in the model. And important, you have to use the ones here at the top, of course, because down there, these are only the constructor argument names. They are not available outside of this model. So that's the name and description. Now about that image. First of all, for that alt text, here, that's a normal HTML attribute, of course, I will use string interpolation to output some text here, the recipe name maybe. But regarding the image source itself, and I'm just splitting this over multiple lines to make it a bit easier to read. Regarding that source, we can follow two approaches. You can either use string interpolation here to output recipe image path here, and that should work fine. Or, as an alternative, you cannot use the attribute plus string interpolation, but you could bind to the source property itself. And now here you don't add curly braces, instead just recipe image path, because now we're using property binding and not string interpolation anymore. So here is a great example of where you may use both string interpolation with the normal HTML attribute, or not using the attribute but directly binding to the source property of the image, and then just putting in a valid expression returning what this property expects, in this case a string, between the quotation marks. Now I will go with the property binding approach here, and since I can't comment this out in here without breaking the element, I'm going to remove it, but I want you to keep in mind that both approaches would work. With that, let's save and see if we see something. And actually, that looks pretty good, but looks like the image I chose does not support deep linking. So that's nice, probably good for them. Let me quickly pick a different image then. So I ended up with picking this image here then. So you can see it here. And now we got the list working. This is the style I want to have. Of course, it doesn't do anything if I click it, but that's something we can add in the future. For now, the recipe list component is taking shape. I want to add one more thing though. I don't want to have this button sit directly on top of this list. So what I'll quickly do in my recipe list component here, between the button and the list, I can simply add a horizontal line to have a little bit of a, well, spacing in between and this nice separation. So that's the list, and you should see that if you add more items to that list, that it automatically grows. So if I simply duplicate this, because I'm lazy, you should see the same recipe twice here. So that's working great. Now let's work on the details section next.